Well, welcome everyone to the Intellectual Property Breakfast Club. My name is Sylvia Syracuse, and I'm Marketing and Events Director for BroadbandBreakfast.com. And I'm hosting the event today as our chairman and publisher, Drew Clark, is unfortunately unable to make it. We're very pleased. We have a very full program today, our largest single panel ever, and the second event in our new Intellectual Property Breakfast series. Just wanted to let you know briefly that we have an upcoming Broadband Breakfast Club event, which is entitled Challenges to Rural Broadband Availability and Adoption, and that's on June 15th at the same time, same place, and we hope you can attend. Jonathan Edelstein, the administrator for the Rural Utilities Service, will be keynoting. I'll introduce our moderator for the current event at the moment. First, I'd ask you to please join me in thanking our sponsors for the event today, and those are Intel, Public Knowledge, and Time Warner Cable. And now I'll introduce Sarah Sterland, who's our moderator today, and Sarah's our assistant managing editor at BroadbandBreakfast.com. Sarah is a veteran reporter. She is reported on legal affairs, business, politics, having covered these subjects for more than 15 years. Her work has appeared in the nation's most recognized media outlets, which include Bloomberg Wealth Manager, Business 2.0, CNN, Congress Daily, Good Housekeeping, National Journal, National Public Radio's On the Media, The New York Post, Red Herring, The Village Voice, and Wired.com. And she's moderated and participated in numerous panels and radio discussions around the country regarding technology and politics. We welcome Sarah today, and I will turn the program over to Sarah.
Morning, everyone. I'd like to just, since we don't have any name tags here, I'd like for the speakers to introduce themselves very briefly, say who they are, what organization they're with, and why they're here, why they're involved in this debate. I'm going to try and make a quick introduction into the subject matter for people on the web. This is going to be recorded for the web, who may be interested in this issue, people at the FCC on the Hill. They should know the issues, but they may be using this for reference. I'm a little bit reluctant to even give a history of retransmission consent rights in case of being accused of revisionist history, which is one of the terms that were used in the filings in this proceeding at the FCC. We've got all these stellar people to tell us which is the correct history, and you can decide. This concept of retransmission consent fees has been a concept that's been controversial from its birth in 1992 in the Cable Television Consumer Protection and Competition Act. Retransmission consent fees refer to the compensation that broadcasters and networks receive for obtaining carriage on cable networks and other forms of distribution platforms. Congress established this system of compensation, or must carry, in 1992 because it saw public interest in preserving the business model of free over-the-air broadcast television, which was starting to be threatened by cable, and cable was competing for advertising. The goal was to provide broadcasters some leverage in a market where cable companies were monopolies. At the time, a Senate committee report on the legislation stated, "The intent of S12 is to ensure that our system of free broadcasting remains vibrant and not to be replaced by a system which requires consumers to pay for television service." The concept was controversial from the beginning for many reasons. The idea of controlling their signals, broadcasters controlling their signals, implies a property right in the signal, which seems to have been conferred upon it by the Communications Act when it specified that nobody else could retransmit the broadcaster's signals without permission. But the signal is using the spectrum that belongs to the public, which the broadcasters were using for free, and they were against which they were selling advertising. cable networks, as far as I could tell, were extending their reach to a larger audience, and I'm sure someone's going to tell me it's much more complicated than that. Cable companies and broadcasters over the years established a bartered solution. I think it was Fox in 1993 that first proposed that TCI, a cable network, carry a basic cable channel in exchange for the right to retransmit local broadcast stations. TCI had to pay a fixed fee per subscriber a month for this new channel. And again, as far as I understand it, this practice has become an industry standard. So fast forward to 2010, the subject has been a topic of conversation in DC again because the Federal Communication Commission in March asked for public comment on whether it should alter its rules that govern the negotiating process over retransmission consent fees. The Commission issued the notice after it received a petition for rulemaking from a coalition of 14 groups that include trade groups such as Matt Polkers, who's sitting in the middle, the American Cable Association, the New America Foundation, of which where Michael Calabrese sitting at the end is part of, and cable companies like Time Warner, where Fernando is a lawyer at, and satellite and telecom companies. The request also comes after some high-profile retransmission consent fee disputes which erupted into public view. For example, 6 million television viewers in Boston, New York, Los Angeles, and Orlando are faced with the prospect of missing New Year's Day football games when one of these fees erupted into the public. But nevertheless, this whole thing is, I don't think it's going to go away because if you look through the FCC filings, all of the filings talk about retransmission consent fees and about how they're increasing over this year over previous years. And Les Moonves of CBS said in a May 5th press release, our strength in prime time establishes CBS as a leading beneficiary of the dual revenue stream broadcast model that continues to emerge, rewarding us not only with strong advertising revenues, but also a growing share of retransmission consent fees that have become a fact of the business. So with that, would you everyone like to introduce themselves and give us a very quick 1-minute summary of your view on the issue?
Sure, thanks, Sarah. Hopefully this is picking me up. My name is Fernando LaGuardia. I'm at Time Warner Cable. And Time Warner Cable is here as one of the petitioners interested in retransmission consent reform, as one of the petitioners who is seeking for the FCC to establish a rulemaking proceeding to fix what we and a whole coalition of other video distributors and public interest groups believe are the problems with the retransmission consent regulatory framework. The problems are evidenced by broadcaster tactics that lead to brinksmanship, threats of blackouts, and actual blackouts in the service that is provided to consumers who are otherwise entitled to receive broadcast programming in the marketplace. And we believe that as well, evidenced by increasing fees for retransmission consent in a manner that Congress surely did not intend in 1992. And we've laid out in our petition why we think the FCC has clear authority to address these problems and to implement solutions that are pro-consumer and allow the marketplace to function. I guess that's a short explanation of why we're here and why we care about it.
Thanks, Fernando.
Good morning. I'm Chad Gutstein. I'm the Executive Vice President of Ovation. Ovation is an independently run national television network and the only national network focused on art and contemporary culture. We support a reform of the retransmission consent regime because we believe that having independent voices in the media landscape is a public interest, and that without reforming the retransmission consent regime, that this interest is threatened. We believe that independent networks deserve a fair playing field, that viable networks deserve competitive access to carriage with a fair rate, and that as more and more of the available funds are driven towards higher and higher retransmission consent fees, that the ability for networks like ours to continue to grow and prosper and thrive is severely threatened.
Thanks, Chad. Tony?
Hi, I'm Tony Cook Bush. I'm a partner at Skadden Arps, Slate, Mager and Flom, and I represent the 4 television networks and in the retransmission consent proceeding. And more importantly, I worked on the Senate Commerce Committee from 1987 to 1992 when we enacted the Cable Act of 1992 and retransmission consent. And in short, I think, there are many different thoughts on how you interpret legislation, but, some people say you just read the plain language of the statute, and the statute says that no cable system or other multi-channel video programming distributor shall retransmit the signal of a broadcasting station or any part thereof without the express permission of the broadcasters. But then if you're one of those people that wants to say, well, but we need to look at the legislative history, then we can look at the legislative history. And in the House said that it was Congress's express intent, quote, to create a marketplace mechanism that allowed 2 business interests to try to reach an agreement. And in the Senate, which is where I worked, the Senate report said that many broadcasters may determine that the benefits of carriage are themselves sufficient compensation for the use of their signal by a cable system. Other broadcasters may not seek monetary compensation, but may instead negotiate other issues with cable systems, such as joint marketing, the opportunity to provide news inserts or cable channels, or the right to program an additional channel on a cable system. At the time, Congress did expressly intend for broadcasters to have the right to charge for their signal or to negotiate, just like any other programmer, for carriage of their system. And I would say that one major difference between 1992 and today is the fact that in 1992, most consumers only had one cable operator. Today, all consumers, with a very few exceptions, have at least 3 multi-channel video providers. In some places, they might have 4 or 5, all of whom carry the local broadcast signal. So it's the network's position that consumers are not held hostage, nor are cable operators. If a cable operator doesn't want to carry or negotiate a deal with the broadcaster, that's fine. And consumers should have the opportunity to switch to a cable operator that has chosen to carry their signal.
Thanks, Tony. Matt?
Matt Polka with the American Cable Association. So let me get this straight. You're responsible for why we're here today. Is that right?
Yes, proudly.
Okay. In that case, I have been working on retransmission consent since 1993 as a small cable operator. So I guess it's become sort of my missionary field, all right? So it's something that I have been working on, representing smaller operators as a practicing lawyer, then as a general counsel for a small company, and now as president and CEO of the American Cable Association, which represents over 900 smaller companies in smaller rural areas that are quite different from the larger operators. In fact, of our 900 members, about 80% of them have 5,000 subscribers or less in very, very small markets where they're on the cusp of providing advanced services and broadband, which is also relevant to today's debate. Our issue really has been one that we have fought since 1993, and we've oftentimes referred to ourselves as sort of the canary in the coal mine, talking about the harm of retransmission consent, particularly as it relates to smaller operators, when retransmission consent was not a cool issue to talk about. We're very happy that this is an issue that is now receiving public debate, and we think that that's appropriate at this time for the Commission to review this, as well as for Congress to be more aware of these issues. Fundamentally for us, as smaller operators, the concerns that we have really are twofold. In terms of the discrimination that we as smaller companies believe that we face at the hands of negotiating with broadcasters who do so by the benefit of the rules, which provide essentially a monopoly marketplace. We as smaller operators pay more simply because we're smaller. And that impacts the ability of our companies to provide advanced services to our customers, services that they want, particularly today when we talk about broadband. We're also very concerned, as we've outlined in our comments, about something that we don't think that Congress intended when the 92 rules were implemented, and that is this proliferation of joint marketing agreements, local marketing agreements, where we now see either through a direct duopoly or through one of these marketing arrangements where one station is negotiating retransmission consent for more than one Big Four station, and as a result, we see prices increasing. So we're very happy to have this debate go on. We thank you for the opportunity to be here and look forward to participating today.
I'm John Hain. I'm a lawyer at Pillsbury, Winthrop, Shaw Pittman. I represent technology companies, wireless companies, and broadcasters. I'll give you the broadcast. I think I'm here for the broadcaster perspective, and
Yeah,
not
we
the technology
filed for
company
Lynn.
perspective.
Yeah.
And I'll give you that perspective in a minute, but I thought I'd start by giving you my perspective. Debates like this play out in rooms like this all over Washington, but they don't originate here. They originate in C-level suites of for-profit companies. There's nothing wrong with for-profit companies. Those are my clients. I like them. I've been in business. I've been in law. I don't disparage anybody seeking a profit. I think it's a great thing. But if you're an executive in the TMT sector, technology, media, and telecommunications, you're expected to deliver growth. That's what your investors are looking for. And that's really at the heart and the seat of this debate. It's not in any of the filings because it's not an appropriate thing to put before the FCC or Congress. But that's really where this originated. Now, there are basically four ways to get more growth. You can grow your market share or your penetration. You can add new lines of businesses or maybe go vertical, which is similar. You can raise your prices or you can lower your cost. There are other ways, but those are the primary ways to achieve growth. Now, what do you do if you're in the multi-channel video, the cable business, the satellite business, the satellite TV business? And I was in it for 6 or 7 years. What do you do to get growth when market penetration is 90%? Most of your growth, by definition, at least 90% of your growth is going to come at the expense of somebody else who's in the same business. How do you grow the pie so that everybody can grow? Again, lower your price, raise price, add new lines of businesses. Share penetration is there's only 10% left to go. And that's what we're talking about here. The MVPD business is rapidly maturing. It's at 90%. Retrans is one of many ways that MVPD providers are looking for growth to deliver to their investors. Another is TV everywhere. Very, very similar. If you're in a pay business and your competition is free, then the only way you're going to grow the last 10% is getting its TV for free, right? If we want to grow the other 10%, we've got to devalue free and convince people to pay. Retrans is great because it attacks two avenues of growth. If successful, it can lower your prices. It can also devalue the free option. And while it's a longer discussion, but free television is not a binary thing. It's not free or not free. If you have free television, it can be bad TV because the revenue stream is not good enough to support the programming that people really want to see, which will result in migration to pay platforms. So that's really what's behind here. It's about growth when you're at a 90% penetrated business.
Thanks, John. Michael?
Okay. Well, Sarah mentioned New America was, along with Public Knowledge, was a nonprofit participant in the petition to ask the FCC to revisit the retrans framework. And, we've been, have this position, for two primary reasons. First is and I think it's been mentioned one way or the other, the actual consumer harm. First from unexpected disruption of programming, particularly programming that's freighted with public interest value, such as local news, weather, emergency alerts, public affairs programming. The upward pressure on cable prices, which has an indirect negative impact on broadband adoption because so many kind of families at the margin surveys are showing are taking broadband in part because it's the marginal cost is part of a bundle with cable TV, and then high switching costs, even where there is competition in the MVPD market. And then the second general reason is that we believe broadcast stations receive huge public subsidies in exchange for transmitting a primary video stream over the air, with the expectation that they will offer, again, as I said, localized news, weather, emergency alerts, children's educational programming, public affairs programming, all free of charge to all consumers. And these subsidies include, first, the most expensive input to production, which is access to the public airwaves at no charge. Imagine if the federal government had built out the networks for the cable and telco companies. We'd probably expect something in return. They also receive must carry, which means the threat of a programming blackout is not reciprocal, and exclusive distribution rights within a local market. So if an MVPD cannot reach agreement with one Fox affiliate, for example, or one station, they can't go and get a substitute signal from another market because Congress has tilted the playing field. So those are kind of the basic reasons that we think that withholding local content should be, if not prohibited, certainly very much a last resort, and we need certain reforms to the retrans framework.
Thank you, Michael. So I just wanted to start with some obvious questions. I think one of the most confusing elements of this debate is whether retransmission consent fees actually do increase the bill for the consumer at the end of the day. I mean, it just seems like one element of many, many costs that cable companies must have, Fernando. So can you explain to us why, what the relationship is?
Sure. I think there's a couple of things to keep in mind about the harm.
And I'm sorry to interrupt, Tony, if you feel like jumping in and making the debate interactive, please go ahead.
So there have been a number of economic studies filed that provide the backup support for this, but when you look at the details over time, there are a couple of components. First of all, you have to think about, just in terms of the economic cost, the fact that broadcasters originally, in order to obtain retransmission consent, negotiated fees for the carriage of affiliated non-broadcast channels. So that is part of the overall context here. Once those channels were launched and given carriage, those fees continue to increase. So you have to consider the context of the overall negotiations. The second is because of the regulatory framework that is in place, broadcasters have, in essence, not a marketplace opportunity to negotiate, but really all of the leverage to negotiate with cable operators for carriage. The rules, as referred to by Matt, essentially make it much easier for them to negotiate favorable carriage in terms of tier placement, carriage of the entire signal. The value of what they're negotiating for is increased, and the options a cable operator has as an alternative are decreased. When you look at the fees over time, the studies that have been done show that there's an increase over time in the fees that are charged for retransmission consent as publicly reported. But that has to be layered on top of the fees for the other channels that are bundled in those negotiations as well, increasing over time. And that is passed through in the marketplace to consumers. However, I don't want to leave you with the impression that that's the only problem. For consumers who are experiencing increased cost as a result of the broken rules, the most important issue, we believe, is the disruption and the uncertainty that they face when they look at their choices in the marketplace, which is competitive for video distribution. the disruption to consumers as a result of the threatened blackout of signals and the threats to disruption are actual costs or reductions in quality in the service that is being provided. So that is also an important element. The fees for retransmission consent go up. The fees for affiliated networks and channels that are bundled with broadcast signals go up. The alternatives to MVPDs in terms of negotiating for retransmission consent aren't there as a result of rules and the regulatory framework that's in place. And consumers see more and more the potential loss of those signals, and that contributes to the problem.
Okay.
I would like to step in here. Well, first of all, I think that the key word in his description was the threat of the loss of signal, because there have actually been very few instances where there's been a loss of signal. And as was suggested in the network filing, that issue could be addressed by simply giving consumers notice. 30 days in advance of when the contract's about to expire, consumers could have notice the contract might expire. They might not be able to carry XYZ network affiliate, and if they want that network, they might need to subscribe to another service. Because all of the programming, the retransmission consent contracts with, DirecTV, EchoStar, the AT&T, Verizon, RCN, Comcast, Time Warner, they're not all on the same schedule. So it's not like they all expire on the same day. So, next Thursday, there's not going to be any broadcast programming. They're staggered, they're all different. Consumers could have the opportunity, if given the notice, to switch.
But Tony, I
And
just
if
want to
if I-
interrupt here. Sorry.
No, wait.
Yeah, okay,
no,
go.
no. I get to finish, then you
Okay.
can,
All right,
you can ask
okay.
your question.
Go
So that
for it.
would be one point, which is that the second point is that the whole focus of the Cable Act was to increase competition. And the Cable Act has succeeded beyond our wildest imaginations. When we were working on this, we never thought that consumers, 18 years later, virtually all consumers, with some exceptions, would have at least 3 providers, and some would have 4 or 5. And so when you look at that, that's a huge achievement. But the second thing is that we did regulate rates. And we regulated rates in the absence of competition. And I'd just like to note that every day practically you pick up or you look at the FCC releases and you see more and more cable operators are found to be subject to effective competition and therefore relieved of rate regulation. Yesterday, ComDaily reported that there were 200 communities where the FCC found that there is now effective competition and no more rate regulation. And so the idea that retransmission consent is responsible for these huge problems, at the same time the cable operators are running up to the FCC saying, look, we've got competition. You don't need to regulate us anymore. I don't think you can have your cake and eat it too.
Okay, but as a consumer, why should I have to try and, I'm pretty busy as it is. Why would I want to, go to look in the papers for a different provider every time one of these disputes?
Well,
come
I
up?
think isn't that like sort of the whole point of competition, which is that if you don't like what one company's providing, you can go somewhere else. Isn't that why we have Target, Walmart, and Kmart? That's the whole goal of our society, is for people to have choice. And it is inconvenient sometimes. Walmart's far from my house, right? But, the Safeway is more expensive. But if I want the cheaper price, I got to go to Walmart.
Okay.
Sarah, can I add a
Yeah,
point?
sure, go
ACA filed comments in the video competition report a little while ago where we demonstrated from our members that nearly 90% of them said on the record that they have increased rates to consumers as a result of escalating retransmission consent fees. So that's a fact. We know that rates, particularly in our markets, are going up. The other thing I'd point out is virtually all multi-video programming distributors are working together to reform retransmission consent rules. So it's not just cable operators. It's the satellite providers, it's the telephone providers. It's all MVPDs that are providing these signals that think that these rules are broken because of the fact that there is not a marketplace that exists for retransmission consent. There may be effective competition in the market, but there is not an effective market for retransmission consent because of the retransmission consent rules coupled with market exclusivity, network non-duplication that prevents there to be competition in the marketplace. In fact, we in ACA asked the Commission to look at this in 2005 with a petition for rulemaking saying there needs to be a right to shop so that you can have market-based retransmission consent pricing. We have found that where our members are exempted from non-duplication rules because they're smaller or because there are significantly viewed stations, that guess what? Where there's competition, the price comes down. All right, that doesn't happen today because a market does not exist for retransmission consent. And that's why we are asking the Commission to take the next step, which is to look at the rules in the context of where it is in 2010 compared to where it was in 1992. And I would say, Tony, at the time, I agreed that I think that there was a legitimate reason for it because you had smaller broadcasters basically having to negotiate with larger cable operators, growing cable operators. Well, that's different today, and we should look at the rules and take a fresh look and revise them as necessary.
Matt, what percentage of the money that your members charge for broadcast stations comes from retrans fees, and what percentage comes from is justified by other things? I mean, didn't your business start? Didn't it originate by taking broadcast signals for which it paid nothing and charging consumers for them? I mean, if the rates, if you want to protect the consumers, why don't you first give up the profit that you're making on the broadcast signals that you've been picking up and selling for 50 years?
But we're not. I mean, but we're not.
You're not?
We're not.
There's no charge for broadcast signals? Was there a charge for broadcast signals when cable started?
No.
Was there a charge for
cost?
I used to be in the cable business. I know there's a charge for broadcast signals because I was in the business.
A subscriber for one of our members could have broadcast basic for basically about $12 or $13 a month, which basically covers the cost of providing that signal rather than the cost of the signal itself. That's
I can't find a broadcast.
And what
basic
John, but I want to remind you, and taking a step back and pointing at what Tony said about the context here, when cable started and when retransmission consent was created as a regulatory framework by Congress, then later in 1992, we were looking at local markets in which broadcasters and cable operators faced each other, and there was a clear opportunity for a mutual agreement in order to reach an outcome that was beneficial to consumers and the public interest. Broadcasters are receiving spectrum, their major asset, for free from consumers, and have an obligation to serve consumers in the public interest, as Mike
I don't
was
know any
pointing out.
broadcasters that charges the consumer for sticking up an antenna and receiving the signal. I mean,
And
isn't
as
that
a
what this is
result,
about? Isn't
of changes that
But-
Tony pointed out in the market since 1992, where consumers have a choice now for video distribution, and they still don't have a choice when it comes to the local broadcast signal, the marketplace has changed and the rules have not kept up with it. So as a result, the problem is not just that broadcasters are charging an increasing amount for retransmission consent. This is an important point. The problem is that consumers are being sent a message, and it's not just the blackouts, it's the threat of blackouts, it's the threatened opportunity for blackouts, are being sent a message that there is a potential for disruption where that didn't exist before. So I think you really have to focus on the fact that that's not serving the interest that Congress intended in the 92 Act. It's not serving consumers, and it's causing a reduction in the value of the output to consumers for video programming. Your point about how much the cost is part of the problem. What I would ask is, how does it serve the public interest to disrupt consumers by threatening to take away broadcast
Well,
signals?
Fernando, I
If
think
I
this
could,
is...
if I could.
Okay.
That's like the American way. I mean, didn't I just read yesterday about 5 tons of garbage in some city that couldn't be moved because the workers had walked out because they weren't being paid enough? I mean, surely there's a health hazard, consumers were inconvenienced, but that's part of our free market system. And so the idea that broadcasters, unlike HBO or Lifetime, have some different obligations is not right.
Yeah,
And
but
if-
they
Well, that
are-
if I could
obligation
just
is in
say- if I could-
Section
if I could-
309 of the Act,
Well,
Tony.
now, and you know what? Anybody can stick an antenna up and get their signal for free. And if you don't want to carry it.
Yeah, what I hear from the
somebody could go to
MVPDs is that
TV,
there
they
should...
could go to
Can I just
Star.
let Michael interject, because he hasn't
No,
said
I'm just
much.
saying, I'm glad that we have a consensus that we should go ahead and have that auction for the broadcast spectrum, a
Well, you know,
two-sided
but-
auction, and if the broadcasters actually
Well, let's-
value it,
do
they
we-
can compete against
But do we wanna
Verizon
talk
and
about-
AT&T Wireless and other,
Do we want to
and
talk
others
about
to
how
buy
much
it, and then
free
there won't be a
spectrum the cable
subsidy.
industry has?
Sorry.
Do we want to talk about the free spectrum that DirecTV and EchoStar have? Did I see them go to an auction? Did I
Or the
miss that
wireless
auction?
carriers.
Did I miss
Okay.
the auction where the cable operators paid for their spectrum? They may not have as much as broadcasters, but certainly DBS does.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing is that the argument, I mean, it depends on how you phrase these things, right? The argument I hear from the MVPDs is that broadcasters should be penalized for giving away their television for free. They don't charge for it over the air, therefore they should not be allowed to charge their competitors for it. The competitors should get a discount because they give it away to consumers for free. I mean, you know, if you're a regulator, I mean, I know what broadcasters want and I know what MVPDs want. That's really easy. You know, if you're a regulator, what kind of world do you want? Do you want a world in which if you go to a pay model, you can make an awful lot more money and acquire all the programming that used to be on broadcast? I mean, why did Disney move Monday Night Football from over the air to ESPN? I'm sorry, Preston. I mean, there were good reasons for that. The market rewarded that move. Disney makes an awful lot more money when it moves its sports programming to ESPN. That's not Disney's fault. That's the way the market has evolved. And retransmission consent is if you want to have decent programming on free TV, there is no, you either got to break up the MVPD business or you've got to normalize the broadcast economics to the MVPD business. I mean, we can debate angels dancing on pinheads all day, but that's the bottom line. You can have free TV with crap on it, excuse me, you know, or you can fix retransmission, or you can regulate programming in the MVPD business to put burdens on that side. But I mean, that's the real world. Nobody here made that up.
Okay,
That's the
well-
way it works.
Well, getting back to just the basics.
Can I just jump in here for a
Sure,
second?
go ahead.
The, you know, I know everyone here seems really close to agreement on this issue. So what I think is missing from this debate right now, though, is the impact that this debate has on the diversity of programming voices that are out there, particularly with respect to independent programmers. Because on the one side, you've got very big media companies. On the other side, you have very big media companies. And in the middle, you have very small media companies that are viable, that are serving, providing programming that serve their consumers and deserve a fair playing field to compete on, because that is the American way. And what you're having instead is these networks being impacted unfairly by an unbalanced playing field that is hampering their ability to get competitive carriage with a fair rate. And that's what we need to grow and survive and continue to provide the programming that we have to audiences that want that program.
Well, Chad, can you tell me, are the rates unfair now? I mean, can you give the audience some idea, has a cable network actually said to you, sorry, we can't carry you because we've got all these other programs? I mean, do you have some specifics that you can?
Well, yeah. I mean, if you're asking, has the retransmission consent fees that are being paid been specifically talked about as a reason for reducing programming fees or reducing carriage? Absolutely.
For you, for Ovation Television?
Absolutely, yes. Has it also been used as a reason why some distributors can't continue to provide additional carriage or provide carriage at all because they're looking at significantly increasing retransmission consent fees? And have they used those type of arguments? Absolutely, yes. This is not theoretical. This is not maybe consumer prices will go up, or maybe one of those 4 or 5 competitors in a marketplace will decide that they want to capture market share by not passing along those costs. This is about the fact that as more and more dollars come into the programming cost till for the operators, they are looking at every single penny that they can throw out. And those of us with the least amount of leverage in this game are the ones that are going to be impacted first and are being impacted first.
Well,
I would just add on that, only
hang on
because-
just for one moment, though, to follow through on that. I mean, you were telling me that Ovation started with 5 million viewers, right?
Yeah, 5 million.
And how many do you have now?
Nielsen has us at slightly under 42 million.
So you have been able to grow. I mean,
I'm not saying we haven't been
and
able to.
So what's
I'm not saying that we haven't been able to grow.
Okay.
I'm saying that that growth is definitely impacted by what is happening right now in retransmission consent. And I think if you look at overall viable independent networks, outside of a couple of sports-owned or sports league-owned networks who have a significant vested interest in seeing more and more money flow into broadcast networks' coffers because it goes right back into paying their license fees, I think you're seeing a lot of the viable independent networks that aren't in that situation lining up on the side of saying, hey, people need to look back at this retransmission consent regime and figure out a way to put a fair playing field back in place.
I'm sorry, go ahead, you first.
Well, I wanted to go back a minute to the history of retransmission consent, because as everybody recalls, when retransmission consent first went into place, the response of the cable industry and the united response of the cable industry was, we'll never pay broadcasters a nickel for their programming. And I never quite figured out why that wasn't an antitrust violation, but there was this concerted agreement and they didn't. And then all of a sudden, as competition developed, as the marketplace changed, as the proliferation of cable programming channels, increased dramatically, once broadcasters put their foot down and said, you are going to pay us, all of a sudden it's not fair. I mean, basically what the argument is that people who have popular programming shouldn't be able to negotiate. That there should be some harness put on them, because then we have to pay more. Because if you follow this logic, then every time you have a hit channel or a hit program on a cable channel, they're going to get more leverage, whether it's sports programming or broadcast programming. They're going to come and say, oh, that's going to make consumers' rates go up, and so you need to regulate them. And that's not how this works. Success is defined by developing programming and going into the marketplace and bargaining for it. And in this changing environment, because we haven't even talked about the impact of the internet and broadband at the broadband conference, I can't see how we're looking to go backwards to rate regulation simply because the cable industry, the multi-channel video industry has banded together and decided we don't like having to pay more for broadcast.
Well, it's not just the
Maybe they've just
industry, it's the
run out of
non-profit
ideas
people.
for the Ocho channel that they can get instead of getting the fees, and so now they're like, well, since we've run out of new ideas for new channels to launch, they're just, rebroadcasting programming we've had in our libraries, that now maybe it's time that we start charging for it, so we can get the growth.
Well, I will say this, is that, since the Cable Act, there has also been an explosion of independent programming, far more than what was in existence in 1992. And I forgot the exact number, but it's like 200 new channels.
Yeah, but most of those are owned by the big
No,
networks
these
anyway.
are independent. No, this is not TV One, this is cable channels.
I can tell you from
with
our
no-
members' perspective, I mean, what Chad was saying, we're not launching more independent programming voices because of the increases.
Right,
but
well,
you
we'd
have-
have to measure it relative.
But that's a different issue.
Everything's
And
relative.
what,
right?
what you're fundamentally talking about, where you're saying it's wrong, why is it wrong for broadcasters to negotiate a fee? Okay, we're not necessarily saying that. I think what we're saying here is that that prices need to be negotiated in what is a legitimate market, and a legitimate market for retransmission consent does not exist. If my member in smaller rural Kansas has to pay at least twice as much for retransmission consent simply because they're small and there's no economic cost justification for that, why should those subscribers in that small community be penalized when that company is also trying to use those dollars to provide advanced broadband services throughout rural Kansas and throughout every other rural state that's out
But
there.
why can't that subscriber then go to DirecTV or EchoStar?
Well, in many cases, they may not be there. They're not necessarily everywhere. See, the other problem here too is that you assume that there's all this competition in the markets where it is not necessarily the case in our markets.
How
And when
many
we're
of
talking about-
your markets
when we're
are you the
talking about-
only provider?
In some cases, there are lots of situations where there's only a few providers and not DirecTV and EchoStar and AT&T and Verizon and the telephone company and a large MSO. So it's fundamentally different. And my view is I think regulators do have a public interest in reviewing this because at the same time, we see a chairman who is so interested in deploying broadband throughout the country as a major policy initiative, and he has to realize that these rates and these other issues affect the ability of providers, ISPs, our members, to actually carry that goal out. And so if he doesn't look at it in context, then his major goal is going to be impacted because we're not going to be able to deploy the broadband that he wants us to deploy.
Well, Matt, let me give you, and you can take this to your members. It's the best thing that your members can do to address all these problems, and you can address the problems not just with the broadcast signals, but also the non-broadcast signals, and perhaps create some channel space for Ovation and other networks. The problem, I mean, we know the problem from the MVPD's provider. The problem from the consumer's perspective and from my perspective is that we have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 competitors in the MVPD space, and they're utterly and totally undifferentiated. Everybody feels like they have to run to the middle. I have to carry every single channel, or I might lose 25 subscribers, or I might lose 5% of my subscribers. Nobody in the MVPD business has the guts to differentiate their business. Therefore, they don't have the guts to say no. So if somebody comes along and offers you an economic package that you don't want to take, you know, I don't want to take ESPN at whatever the rate is versus the a la carte rate, none of the MVPDs are willing to say no. And that's why we have all of this competition is utterly and totally undifferentiated. The first MVPD, the first big one that says no to one of the national program networks and takes the 1 or 2 or 3 or 4% subscriber hit that they're going to take, it's going to change everything. But they
John,
don't have the guts to do it.
that's not going to happen because most of the viewers who watch television, it's all focused on the networks, and so they're never going to give up that programming.
You know,
I find it remarkable, John, that you're suggesting that...
Fernando, can you just
Listen,
hold on for a second?
CBS has great programming. It's a great network. It's a national brand. It is not essential. We can all live without it. It's not an essential input
that's not what
to an
the-
MVPD.
that's not what the
business.
statistics
If you
reflect,
give up
though.
CBS, you lose some of your subscribers. But if they're charging too much, you can lower your rates, and through the lower rates, you can pick up other subscribers.
Okay, Fernando.
We don't need 4 undifferentiated competitors.
I find it remarkable that the broadcast argument is that the product is either worthless or comparable to garbage, or that it's unnecessary and has no value. I think that the marketplace reality...
That is a complete mischaracterization of what
Thank
I
you, Tony.
said, and I resent that.
Well-
And I will not let you sit there and say that. I am talking about a competitive marketplace, and I am saying that cable operators should have to pay for broadcast programming just like they pay for other programming.
And the problem with that,
they
Tony,
shouldn't-
and you were
if-
analogizing to a marketplace when you talked about it, and the marketplace you analogized to was an example of municipal trash. That was your example, not mine. The problem is that Congress already decided that this is not a marketplace. So it is too cute by half to look at the situation as it exists today and the consumer disruption and harm that is demonstrated today and say that, well, now it's a marketplace. And now, because there's competition at the distributor level, that marketplace can be leveraged and taken advantage of by broadcasters in a way that harms consumers.
Let's
that
talk
you
about
can say to
harming consumers. Let's
consumers
talk about
that you
harming
have to take a
consumers.
walk in order to get the product, or
Time
that you
Warner
have to pay more in order to get the product. That is not what Congress intended, and you know it. It's not what the statute provides. And the fact is that now's a perfect time for the commission to take a look at it because of those harms.
Okay, John, let Tony.
Well, I would
respond.
just go back and say, again, Congress did intend to create a marketplace. They did intend to give broadcasters, and they expressly gave them the right to control their signals and to seek payment or other compensation from cable operators. That was the express intent. There is no equivocation about it. And the fact that cable operators don't like it and that it may create, uncomfortableness in the market does not make it wrong or bad. That is how our competitive system works. The goal of regulation is to fill the void when there's a lack of competition. And in this case, there is adequate competition, and consumers are protected by the competition.
So
But
Congress
there's
in
no
the
competition
92
with
Act
broadcast signals.
had, let me try to get a word in. Congress in the 92 Act also gave the FCC authority to regulate this retransmission process, in the public interest. And the primary public interest here, and I think the broadcasters just can't walk away from the fact that they took a bargain, decades ago, that they're being paid by the public to deliver a free stream of content with, a whole variety of things that they say are so essential. So now when we're talking about reallocating, the FCC's National Broadband Plan, they're saying, again, we need to reallocate more of the TV spectrum, which is so lightly used, to broadband. And the argument is, oh, no, this over-the-air content, localized channels, localism, diversity, it's so incredibly essential. What would we do without, emergency alerts and weather reports, local news, and this and that? And so really what we're concerned about is not whether in these retrans negotiations that cable or broadcasters or TBS and broadcast, get a little bit more or less money. It's this notion of disruption of service, which is completely contrary to the bargain that the broadcasters have with the public. And so there are really, we haven't actually talked about the actual reforms that the FCC has the authority, the express authority under the 92 Act to do, which is that they can put in place mandatory interim carriage as long as there's good faith bargaining. They can put in place binding arbitration or some sort of administrative law ALJ process or expert panel that would resolve these disputes. So so you can still have the negotiation, you can still have each side, you can still have money changing hands, but you can do it without disruption of service.
Well, let me say this. One of my questions is, why isn't the public interest community supporting the broadcaster's request that the FCC require cable operators to give notice 30 days in advance, 60 days, you
That
pick
should
the
be part of it,
number.
too.
I think
Right,
that's already
they're-
in the law, that anytime that
No,
there's a contemplated
there- no,
change, we
you-
have to give 30
Yeah, but
days.
Matt, what you do is you
You
take
haven't let me
out ads in the legal
you
section of
haven't
the
let
paper
me
in two-point
finish.
type.
Well,
You haven't let- wait, you haven't-
You guys run crawls on the
Okay,
bottom of
guys.
the screen that says your
You haven't let me
Let
finish.
Tony finish, and I would
My
like.
point
I
is
want to
that-
open it up to questions and answers. So we'll let Tony finish, and I also have one last question myself for Tony, which is, we're not talking about ending fees for broadcasters. We're only talking about arbitration and interim carriage, and then also notice might be. I mean, the cable company is actually required to give
But they're
notice
not
anyway.
But they're not required to give
Right.
notice of the fact that the signal is available from other sources. And that is how the notice should be expanded, because the public interest community should support that requirement, because then consumers will know and have the opportunity to change.
Well, like I said, we don't need to provide that notice, because you do across the bottom of the screen with a crawl message that says, leave your cable operator and go to Dish and DirecTV. We don't need to do that, because you're helping us for
So you
it.
don't have a problem with it?
Well, we have a big problem with it, because you're supposedly trying to negotiate with us in good faith. At the same time, you're telling our customers to go to somebody else.
The
I
only-
agree
the
with
only-
everything Tony said except one thing, and that is that consumers will have an opportunity to switch. And here's another thing going on in the background that nobody talks about. Early termination fees, lock-in, automatic renewal with rate increases. You want to talk about rate increases to consumers? Let me tell you what Time Warner Cable's, well, go look it up for yourself on the internet, Time Warner Cable subscriber agreement. Time Warner Cable, when you sign up, says you sign up for a year or 2 years, you get a discount. We're giving you a discount to sign up to the bundle for a year or 2 years. At the end of that period, if you do not give us written notice 90 days before termination, we renew you for another 1 or 2 years. We reserve the right to raise your rates and drop services, and you're locked in, and if you don't give us 90 days advance notice, we'll hit you with up to a $250 termination fee. So Time Warner Cable subscribers, at least, and I know Verizon subscribers because I have the same agreement at my house, they really, I mean, you do have the option to go elsewhere, but you've got to send Verizon or Time Warner Cable a quite hefty check, which will more than make up for all the retrans fees that they paid on my behalf.
Fernando, do you want to respond to that before we move on?
You know, customers in the marketplace have a choice when it comes to video distribution. I think that we do a good job in that competitive marketplace. The customers of broadcasters do not have a choice. The video distributors have to deal with broadcasters who have congressionally authorized, essentially, a position which nobody can negotiate with. So it's ironic for representatives of broadcasters to say that in a competitive marketplace, customers have a choice. The fact is, it's the lack of choice that's causing the problem here. And that problem is the disruption and the threat of disruption that consumers face. Putting consumers in the middle as a result of these negotiating tactics is contrary to the public interest. It's not a functioning marketplace.
Okay, Tony, please answer this one question before we go to the questions. Why can't the FCC just open a proceeding? What's wrong with finding out whether the system is or isn't working? What's wrong with arbitration and interim carriage?
The FCC can open any proceedings they want. That's
Yeah.
not, the issue is what they're allowed to do under the Act. And under the Act, they're not allowed, under any circumstances, to require a broadcaster to be carried against that broadcaster's will.
Okay, all right, so questions?
Hi, I just wanted to go around the table. I think Jonathan Make with ComDaily. We were a couple points talking about the consumer notice provisions and what the broadcasters want, which is not just when there's going to be a channel lineup switch, but when a contract is coming up.
Yeah, that would be an important, I think, part of reforming the retrans framework is that there should be, again, some substantial notice to the MVPD customer that they could be, losing a certain signal so that they have time to shop around for an alternative. I mean, I agree that in reality there's very high switching costs, which raises a separate set of issues, but at a minimum the consumer should have something like 60 days, notice to figure out, if CBS is really worth that much to them, whether they can get an acceptable package elsewhere. But it really is, tough now that we've lashed television, which personally I don't value as highly as broadband. We've lashed in an increasing number of cases television to broadband and even to wireless in a bundle, which just raises the switching costs even further.
But that's bundling that is favorable to the MVPD industry, so that's good bundling. We have to distinguish good bundling from bad bundling.
I just want to address the notice point, if I can, if we're going to answer it. I think it's interesting, providing customers with information, I think, is a good thing. I think, though, you have to understand the bargaining dynamic that's taking place in the marketplace. Notice of disruption, just like actual disruption, is a consumer harm. It causes anxiety, uncertainty, and confusion. So essentially what is being asked for here, I'm taking it as a good faith request to provide customers with notice about the potential for disruption. But the fact is, you see it happening already as a tactic to increase the bargaining leverage by broadcasters. So there's a component of notice that is actually harmful to the marketplace. Why is it harmful? It causes consumer distress, it causes uncertainty, It may lead some consumers to switch to their second or third best alternative or fourth best alternative MVPD when they didn't otherwise have to. I disagree with John that those choices are undifferentiated. Time Warner Cable invests substantially in programming and service that we believe differentiate ourselves from our competitors, local programming being among the most important elements of that, 24-hour news services, other forms of local information programming. So we may be a consumer's first choice. They may switch unnecessarily. If you look at the economics here, you have to seriously think about the implications of notice. As part of reform, and I think that at least there is support for some commission looking at this situation, because if you're supporting a notice requirement that is more than the notice requirement that already exists, you need the commission to look at the problem. Looking at the problem, though, means clearly understanding the bargaining dynamics. Notice that reputational and enhanced aspect, saying that you're willing to take your customer to the brink of a shutdown, increases the leverage on the part of the broadcaster. So it is part of a dynamic that is not necessarily pro-consumer. And we need to think carefully about how it helps consumers to know what's going on and how it doesn't help. And when you see it happening already as part of the negotiating tactic, recognize that it's not always pro-consumer.
What I would just add before we go to one question is this is a perfect reason why the commission simply needs to put out a rulemaking to look at these issues, because things have fundamentally changed since 1992. Things that were not intended necessarily, that now the commission has an obligation, just like Chairman Janikowski said he was going to do, to keep this under active review, to actually look at these rules and to determine if any changes should be made. I find it perplexing why the broadcasters would oppose that.
Well, I think that the commission has a lot of issues to look at, and I think that it is not a good use of the commission's resources to spend time examining a competitive marketplace because some people are unhappy that all of a sudden they can't just say, no, we're not going to pay you anymore. And that is the Cable Act is very clear that Congress intended for broadcasters to be able to negotiate for compensation.
John Mansell, consultant. Well, if the market is truly competitive, why don't you make it a little bit more competitive and allow the cable operator to import a distant network affiliate? After all, they already receive or can receive copyright royalties for it. And second question is, why not allow a cable operator to become a network affiliate? Why do you need exclusivity?
I'll answer
What?
I'm sorry.
No,
Tony,
go, John. No, I want you to go.
There's the non-dupe rules have been misportrayed, and I would just urge anybody who is interested in this to go read them. What the network non-duplication rules do is constrain the ability of a broadcaster to enforce exclusivity that it has been able to negotiate for. The network non-dupe rules do not give a single broadcaster any advantage. I think probably the entire broadcast industry would be quite happy if the network non-dupe rules were eliminated. There's nothing in antitrust law or anywhere else that prevents anybody, from any distributor, from granting exclusive distribution territories. The non-dupe rules, in the absence of the non-dupe rules, it'd be very easy for every broadcast network to say, here's your exclusive distribution territory. It goes to the DMA edge. It doesn't go an inch over. The non-dupe rules constrain that. So they're not an advantage. They're a big disadvantage. And I think if we all can agree here to repeal the non-dupe rules, maybe we can all go home and have accomplished something.
Right, and
That's really interesting because that's not the way it happens.
Right, and I also...
Those rules are walls that prevent marketplace competition. That's what happens.
So we both vote on repealing them.
But as
Sure, and let's let marketplace conditions prevail. Just as John was saying, I mean, this is what we asked for. Let's have a right to shop. We all understand it makes sense. If you can get a lower price and go out and shop, then have a right to shop. But you can't do that now because, nope, got to protect that market.
No, if you
But
got rid
even
of
if but even if you repealed the rules, it still doesn't guarantee that you would have the right, that you are still would have to require broadcasters under your theories to make their signal available to you. What if they said, what if they did what you asked and broadcasters still said no?
Our point as it relates to network non-duplication is to create more, what you call, competitive marketplace conditions which do not exist today in retransmission.
How many sources do you have for the USA Network?
You got one, but the problem,
Okay.
but you have other services that you can also add on as well. But what I'm talking about here, what we're talking about here, unfortunately, is your broadcast station happens to be a regulated entity, unlike a USA Network. It's different. It uses the public airways. So the FCC regulators have a public interest in regulating it.
So
And
broadcast should
consequently,
be
it's
cheaper.
different.
Broadcast
So we-
stations should be
so
No, it
cheaper.
just should be regulated
They should be
differently.
cheaper?
So does-
And
Should they be cheaper?
There should be.
They should be
there
cheaper.
be
Tell me.
there
You want them to
should
be cheaper.
No, I'm
That's
not
what you
saying it
want.
should be
You want them to
cheaper.
be cheaper.
I'm saying there should be marketplace conditions.
I do.
so
It's
does that-
unfair
under your-
because Sarah
under
doesn't
your-
have a microphone, so
Right.
she can't ask for a question.
Can I just make one point? And so does that
There's a
mean
question
DirecTV and EchoStar should be regulated the same way, since they have free spectrum?
You know what? You're twisting now my argument. What I'm talking about
I'm just
is
asking
a
the
marketplace condition for retransmission consent that does not exist today. DirecTV and EchoStar would like the same benefit of a marketplace for the negotiation of broadcast signals that does not exist
So
today.
everybody that gets free spectrum isn't the same.
Yes, I was wondering if any of this has any implications as far as internet broadcasting, as the internet starts to become more like the cable big brother, so to speak, with more regular programming and more control. Will these kinds of implications be tested out and then hopefully clarified for the internet broadcasting industry?
Well, I would say that they don't have, I mean, these issues are not relevant to the internet, that the internet is not regulated, and that's been one of the great things about it and why you have a proliferation of content on the internet. And so, you know, to say, oh, we're going to treat the internet like a multi-channel video provider, and then we're just going to dump it, you know, I don't think anybody wants that. And so I think the answer is no. I think that the internet is still uncharted territory, that there's experimentation going on every day that's critical to the development of content and competition, and so I would say no.
No, but I mean, if someone wanted to redistribute the networks online, they'd still have to go through this negotiation process, wouldn't they?
Well, that's, I mean, let's just back up. Just because the networks broadcast over spectrum that they didn't buy doesn't mean that America owns their programming and anybody can do with it what they want. They spend a lot of money creating the value of their programming. That's like saying USA Network, you know, should have to give its programming away for free.
I have a question. How much does Hulu pay in retransmission consent for the network's programming?
What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, because on the one hand, cable, the distributors that I deal with, right, they pay for the content. You want them to pay for increasing
You know,
prices
that's-
for the broadcast content, but then you give it away for free online.
You know, those are all issues that can be negotiated amongst the cable operators and the broadcasters in their contracts. And just like the same issue can be negotiated if USA Network decided it was going to give its programming away for free, that's a negotiation issue. If Ovation decides you're going to give, that's something you negotiate with the cable operator or whoever else is going to retransmit your signal.
And it's not a theory, that is negotiated. That's an
Right, and
issue
so
in
that
every
is-
single retrans
So that,
negotiation.
and you know, just like if you're going to have it available on a cell phone, if you're going to put it on the iPad, you know, you negotiate that. And broadcasters have the same rights to do that.
But I think when you say that, you have to look and put it in its historical context. And one of the things that I found in this industry is that there's a lot of things that are based on how it was developed, when it was developed, and historical precedent probably plays a similar type of strength and role in a negotiating process in this industry as it does in the courts. I mean, precedent seems to be king. And when you have what is going on now, which is changing an economic dynamic, it's not necessarily changing all the history of precedent in the way these operations work. And new entrants face a very, very different dynamic than people that have been there for a very long time. And that's just reinforcing the unfair playing field that those of us on the independent spectrum feel every single day.
But I would say that in our environment, that is a challenge every time we have changes. There are a lot of companies that say, you know, I'd like to be the #1 company that shows up when somebody types in, Mexican food. I don't want Taco Bell to be there. I want, Tony's restaurant to be the number one thing.
But isn't there a
But just
public
be- but
interest in
that's not
having an
something that-
independent
but
media
I'm- but are you-
voices? Isn't there a
There
public
is,
interest that's
and there
supposed
has
to be
been
protected?
there has been a dramatic increase. I think it's 165 new channels in the last 10 years of independent programming that is not owned or controlled by a multi-channel video provider.
Okay, so at this point, I don't know if this is even on. I have one other question for you guys. One proposal from the public interest groups has been, why don't the broadcasters just tell us how much they charge for every channel, every subscriber per channel a month? But then I would assume that even the cable people would have to make that disclosure if we made those changes. Fernando, can you tell me if Time Warner Cable would be willing to, and Tony, do you think that that's a viable solution?
It's not one of the solutions that we propose, although I think it's important to consider all of the proposals that have been put forward, because I think they're made, and I include the notice proposal and the proposal to disclose fees. All of them should be considered carefully on the record by the Commission, with an eye towards whether or not they would actually result in improving marketplace conditions for consumers. From our perspective, the solution here is much more simple and involves some sort of a standstill to eliminate the threat of disruption in the marketplace, and then some kind of a resolution mechanism, if necessary, as a backdrop or backstop for parties who are unable to reach an agreement. I think that that's simpler. It's a simpler solution, but I think that there are a number of different ideas that have been put forward, and they all deserve consideration.
I don't think the Commission needs to spend any more time on this. I think that, the fact of the matter is the marketplace is working, and the proof of that is the fact that the multi-channel video providers are so unhappy because they don't want to negotiate. And all they can talk about is the threat and the uncertainty, and that I think that that is a part of competition. And I think that what the Commission needs to be focused on are issues that really do affect consumers, and the idea that because two companies, may, go up to the wire in a negotiation is not a problem. And I think there are a lot of other problems. I think the issue of requiring everybody, again, we can't require everybody to say what their prices are for everything. That's ridiculous. There would never be any ability in a free market system to do business. There is a limit to the benefits of transparency. And I don't think that, independent programmers, I don't think that, small cable operators, want to have to negotiate in public on every issue.
Okay. Are there any other questions from the audience? Nope. Okay. Well, thank you very much to the panelists for your time, and the audience for coming at 8 o'clock in the morning.
Before we conclude, we'd like to call your attention to our upcoming events on the back of the program. July 13th is our next Intellectual Property Breakfast Club event. It's on the Anti-Counterfeiting Trade Agreement. And June 15th is our next broadband breakfast, and that's Challenges to Rural Broadband Availability and Adoption. July 20th is our Smart Grid Telecommunications and Electric Infrastructure. And please join me in thanking our sponsors again, Time Warner Cable, Public Knowledge, and Intel, as well as our moderator, Sarah Sterling, and our panelists.